Good evening, and thank you for joining another SPJ International Community IC Talk. I am Nerissa Young, Professor of Instruction at the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University in beautiful Athens. Last week, I found a news release that shows, based on journalist resumes, Ohio University is the number 6 school in the country for putting foreign correspondence in the field. I am teaching a foreign correspondence course this fall and took students to Germany in May for an international mass media class. Before we start, and as people get logged in, there are some housekeeping items we need to take care of. Please use the chat feature to let us know where you're from. Put your name and where you're watching from there so we can see who's with us tonight. The format today is going to be simple. The guest and I are going to have a conversation, and we want you to be participants in that conversation. So if along the way you have a question for our guest, please use the Q&A function for questions. The chat feature is to introduce yourself and tell us where you're watching from. The co-chairman of the international community, the multi-talented Dan Kubisky, and I will keep an eye on that window so we can bring your questions into the conversation. Dan will also be keeping an eye on the chat window in case you have any questions about SPJ, the international community, or have technical issues. He will also be posting links and information related to the IC and our discussion. Just as a reminder, this conversation is being recorded and will be placed in our YouTube channel. Welcome again to those who just got logged in. Our guest tonight is John Maxwell Hamilton. He is literally the man who wrote the books, plural, on ways for journalists to link local and global events. One of those is Journalism's Roving Eye, a history of American news gathering abroad. John is the author of 8 books, including his latest, French 75, a history of a popular drink that came out of World War I. Unfortunately, due to the virtual nature of this conversation, we can't serve French 75s to the audience, but John can help with a recipe in his book. He is a longtime journalist and public servant. John is the Hopkins P. Brazil Professor in Louisiana State University's Manship School of Mass Communication, go Tigers, a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Reported domestically and abroad from the Christian Science Monitor and ABC Radio. He was a longtime commentator for Marketplace, broadcast nationally by Public Radio International. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Politico, the Financial Times, and The Nation. He also had a distinguished career in the U.S. government and at the World Bank. John is a Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in journalism from Marquette and Boston universities, respectively, and a doctorate in American civilization from George Washington University. I could go on, but then we wouldn't have time to actually talk with John. I am honored to have been given a special dispensation to call our guest Jack. So, Jack, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to hearing the questions that are asked and do my best to answer them.
Let's jump right in. You wrote in Journalism's Roving Eye, all the problems of journalism are magnified in foreign news gathering. You note the cost of having foreign correspondence and the inability of editors back home being able to second guess those correspondents as they would with a local beat reporter because they do not have the same level of knowledge of the events being reported. With the economic situation in the news media the way it is, and if foreign coverage is so expensive, why should news outlets invest in foreign news gathering?
Well, before I actually answer the main question you asked, let me give you 2 unsolicited comments that may help put this in context. First of all, if we're looking at crises in American journalism today, the greatest crisis we face is the absence of adequate local news. And we have lots of communities that are not being covered well. And that's perilous, I think, for the functioning of our democracy. it has to be the first order of problem that needs to be addressed. The second thing that I should say, and I will come back to, is that there are lots of reasons not to cover foreign news. I'm going to go into those at the end of my answer to this question. But I think it's important to keep in mind that it is indeed very expensive, and it ranks rather low in terms of audience interest. The reason it's important is that, first of all, our involvement in the world has become greater and greater. This is not a brand new concept. Back in 1924, Paul Scott Maurer, the first journalist that won a Pulitzer Prize for foreign news, he was a European correspondent for the Chicago Daily News, used the term interdependence to discuss what was happening in the world today and how Americans were entwined with the rest of the world. It's not a new concept at all. But it is a concept that becomes more and more of what it is every year. We now know that when people get sick abroad, we get sick. We know that there's hardly anything that happens in the world that doesn't somehow resonate back in the United States. In fact, conceptually, if you think about it, there was a way to think about foreign policy many, many decades ago where you could fancy that the best way to proceed was for you to win in arguments, for you to be the dominant power. But in a world as intertwined as the one is today, your weakness actually, or the weakness of other countries, becomes your weakness. In other words, if other countries can't handle their health problems, or if other countries are destroying their environment, the consequences of those things actually come back to the United States. There's no escaping that. I also think it's more important for another local or domestic reason, and that is so many Americans are thinking in terms of America first, also an old idea, but one that has a lot of cachet with Americans today. Now, having said all that, let's talk about why you wouldn't do it, or what the reasons are that get in the way of having foreign news coverage. You've outlined, Narisa, the issues of cost, and that certainly is the case. But there are also other ones. One is that polls show that Americans do not really pay attention to foreign news the way we would want them to do if we cared about foreign news. Now, I admit many polls, when people answer polls, they often say they do care. But in practice, we know that the readership of stories from abroad tends to be rather low, and it has always been that way historically. In fact, after every war, foreign correspondents in the last century wrote articles about how it was too bad that foreign news was falling off. But in fact, the real way to look at it was the wars increased the amount of foreign news. And it was so the additional coverage of the greater coverage was anomalous. It wasn't the fact that foreign news was falling off that was strange. It was that there had been more foreign news. And of course, the reason there's more foreign news in the case of wars is very simple. Foreign news is really a local story. It's about young men and now women who go abroad and fight for the country and whose lives are at risk. And those stories become very tangible to American audiences and much more immediate. They also have a more immediate direct, sometimes, impact on the economy. So the idea of foreign news being in short supply is not new. The idea of a lot of costs existing is not new. And there's a third thing that's important. It used to be, in the case of networks, for example, that they spent enormous amounts of money to have large cores of foreign correspondents. If you think about that, it's very impractical. How many foreign news stories could actually appear in a half-an-hour newscast every weeknight? Not many. And yet there were numerous bureaus abroad. And of course, some of those bureaus could dispatch a reporter from Rome to cover a story in Africa and so forth. Parachute journalism is not a new occurrence. But there was a very high cost and a very limited utility. But there were two reasons that was supported by owners of networks. One of them was that they felt like those foreign outposts were, for them, a sign of the greatness of the news organization. And I might add that also applied to newspapers. Newspapers and publishers like to get all the reporters to come to Paris once a year and meet and have a grand dinner, because the publisher could feel as though these were his embassies abroad. And there was a great psychic reward that came from having foreign reporters. In the case of networks, in addition, they had very few competitors when it came to foreign news footage. Today, you can get foreign news footage, you can buy it from all kinds of vendors, as it were. But in the days when CBS News and then NBC News, ABC was a latecomer to this, were providing foreign news, they were the only ones that had it. So in that sense, it was a plus in terms of advertising your ability as a news provider. Today, nobody can claim that they have exclusive control over foreign news coverage. In fact, now what you can do is just get on your computer and see all that you want. So those as a result of those two things, the need to have the value of having a foreign report or a foreign correspondence diminishes somewhat. And of course, the costs are great, and we see that networks it has decreased for networks, and it's also decreased for newspapers. In the case of newspapers, of course, there's another aspect, and that is that newspapers don't have the marginal income, the marginal revenue to pay the high costs for foreign correspondence. The Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, they never had big corps of foreign correspondents. They had boutique corps that had half a dozen journalists in them. And they could send them around, and it was another badge of honor for them. But now they can't afford to do that. The costs are just too high, and in order to attract readers, they have to do a better job of having local news. This, by the way, doesn't get in the way of my point earlier that we don't have enough local news. Many newspapers are out of business altogether. Anyway, to sum it all up, foreign news is expensive, and many of the reasons to maintain foreign news bureaus today are even stronger than they were before.
Thank you. We want to remind folks, if you have a question for Jack, please put that in the Q&A box. For those of you who have not logged in to the chat box to tell us who you are and where you're watching from, we certainly hope that you'll do that so that you'll feel included in this conversation. Moving on to my next question. This is a difficult time for journalist safety in the US, let alone the world. We've just celebrated the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, who were part of a prisoner exchange with Russia. Austin Tice, a freelance American journalist, was abducted in Syria in 2012, and his whereabouts remain unknown. What can journalists, news organizations, and the public do to increase pressure on governments that are holding journalists without cause? I know Wall Street Journal was very active in sharing information and making it known about Evan's situation.
Well, again, let's start with a little history about how we got into this fix. In the last century, up to, I guess, the Cold War, we'll say, American journalists had a huge comparative advantage. We had our moments of imperialism, for example, against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War and acquiring the Philippines, Guam, and some other outposts. But our record was a much shorter record of imperialism than that belonged to the Germans, the French, the British. And so as a result, and the Spanish, and as a result, we were perceived in a more positive way in countries abroad that had been victims of colonization. One way to think about this is the case of Edgar Snow, whom I've written a biography of and therefore I know something about. Snow was the man who interviewed Mao Zedong, the first Western journalist, the first foreign journalist to interview Mao. Mao at the time was held up in Bao'an, which was way off in the distance, and many people thought the communists were red bandits, that they didn't even really have ideology. And they decided in the mid-1930s, at the same time that the Japanese were making incursions into China, that they wanted to be known on the public stage. And Snow was the one that they picked or allowed to come up and interview Mao. They could have, there's no way they would have picked a German, no way they were going to pick somebody from Japan, that's for sure. Uh, they picked an American because Americans seem to be emblems of democracy. Something else to say about Snow that helps put this in perspective too. It was a lot easier to be a foreign correspondent in those days than it is today. I went back and actually looked this up yesterday in anticipation that this question might be asked. You know, when Edgar Snow sold his first article for the Saturday Evening Post, which was an extremely important magazine at that time, they had to lay on extra cars, and railway trains had to lay on extra cars to make sure the copies of the magazine were delivered around the United States. I remember very well as a boy that the Saturday Evening Post was one of the primary magazines that my parents subscribed to. When Snow published his first article for them, he got $750, which may not seem like a lot today, but it was actually worth quite a lot then, and even more when you think about what it cost him to live in Beijing. He paid in every month $35 for food and rent. That's all he paid. Costs were very low living abroad. And so here was a guy, and many others were in the same boat, who represented a huge number of magazines and newspapers that were able to go abroad and were able to get stories. I would argue that the golden age of foreign reporting was the time between the wars, which is often thought of as a time of isolationism. But in fact, many Americans were going abroad. It was just the American government didn't want to be involved politically. But emotionally, culturally, and even intellectually, there was a great deal of involvement overseas. Well, what do we have today? Well, we have today journalists who are American journalists who basically have a bullseye on their backs. Now Americans are seen as being just as bad as any other imperialist nation. They're not seen as doing anything that's helpful to the most terrorist organizations. And so the result of that is that you can score more points from a propaganda point of view from killing a journalist and doing things that we consider and are atrocious, beheading journalists like the case of Daniel Pearl, and abducting them. And as has happened often. In the case of Putin, he can arrest somebody, more than somebody, numerous people. And actually, what does it cost him? Not much. In fact, he gets leverage in terms of getting back his own people. I can't remember any case in the Soviet Union up to the Cold War, where any American journalists, where the communists took journalists prisoners, state prisoners. I don't think there's any case of that. Today, I think Putin sees that there's no cost at all. And so that's a very changed circumstance. What we need to do, of course, is we need to put the pressure on foreign countries to return journalists, but we also have to recognize, and I don't like saying this, that there's also an incentive to capture journalists if you can use them as a bargaining chip. And a big paper like the Wall Street Journal has a much better chance of getting somebody back than, say, a freelance American journalist who doesn't represent a media organization that if he has a vested interest in him or her coming back. So I don't have a panacea for how we apply pressure. I think we're going to see more journalists being captured. The only other thing I would say on this topic is we are doing a better job today than was ever done up to the 1980s in terms of educating journalists and training them to avoid being captured and to come out alive when they're in difficult circumstances, including war. You know, there's one journalist I admire particularly, even though he was a very complicated person emotionally, and that was Jack Belden. Everybody's forgotten Jack Belden. He was really maybe the greatest war correspondent of the 20th century. He put himself in all kinds of dangerous situations. He wrote incredible stories about what Chinese soldiers were enduring in fighting the Japanese during the 1930s. He wrote two fabulous stories for Life magazine covering himself being shot and then recovering. And he wrote a book called Still Time to Die, which deals with much of this. But as I say, Belden had suffered great psychological hardship, what we today would call PTSD, and that was never diagnosed. And nobody at Time Life, when he eventually went to work with them, really understood what it was. And they didn't do much to take care of it. Even though, I mean, they took care of his physical wounds, but not his other wounds. I'm not sure how much help they could have given him. He ended up at the end of his life being pretty much down and out in Paris, to borrow a phrase from George Orwell. But we do a better job of preparing journalists. But I don't see that it's profitable for me to come up with solutions that I don't see. I think this is now a serious problem for American journalists.
And if the answers were easy, Austin Tice would be home.
Right.
Point taken. Point taken.
That's a good point. That's a nice way to put it.
Based on your experience and knowledge, what is the international story that U.S. news organizations are missing in terms of sending foreign correspondents or picking up and distributing news from those countries?
Right. So I think one thing that is important to say is that even though some news coverage has dwindled, that is, network coverage isn't what it once was, isn't as rich and extensive with on-the-spot reporters. Even though Newsday and the Philadelphia Inquirer do not have corps of foreign correspondents like they once did, there's a lot of very good reporting going on. And some of it's from traditional news providers. The New York Times reporting in Ukraine has been exceptional. The Wall Street Journal's reporting has been exceptional. It's been courageous. And by the way, dealing with those people who have been imprisoned, as well as those people who cover wars, they put themselves at tremendous risk. And we really should honor, in fact, I've written about this in a column I write for Real Clear Politics. We should really honor these people who suffer as a result of their dedication to providing news. They're heroes in my mind. There's also news that's coming from sources that didn't exist before. Bloomberg News more than accounts or more than compensates in terms of sheer numbers for all the foreign correspondents that have been taken out of the field. They have hundreds abroad. Now, they don't necessarily have the same brief to do investigative journalism, although they do some of that. But there are a lot of people abroad who are doing work to cover the rest of the world. And we have found that a lot of organizations and individuals who are in places to know and find out the news are actually supplying it for us. And that's very good. So I think we still have pretty good coverage of the world, pretty good coverage, generally. Do we have enough that you have to look at it, though, in sort of two ways. How much is there out there, and how much is it actually consumed by average Americans? In other words, the average American can't read Bloomberg, the full Bloomberg report, because it's too expensive, for example. So then, okay, the question becomes, what are the stories that need to be covered? And you say story, but I would say stories. I think one of them, and of course I have a special interest in this, is helping readers, viewers, listeners understand why what's happening abroad has an impact on their lives. I did an SPJ project now more than 35 years ago, that tried to show how you can cover foreign news locally. And I got money from Ford and Carnegie and others to help me go around the United States and show how this could be done. I worked with papers, and as Dorisa pointed out, I wrote a couple of books on it and many articles. But we have to do more of that, and some of that can be done locally. That was the point of that project. But it also can be done by foreign correspondents who need to be mindful of how they explain why it matters, which of course journalists and editors do more of now. They put headlines on why does it matter. Well, I think we need to really emphasize that in foreign reporting. Why does it matter? That's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would point out is that I think a story that needs more coverage for more Americans, and this directly addresses the concern I have about Americans turning inward, is how our influence abroad is dwindling or slipping. You know, it's hard to overstate how strong the United States was at the end of the Cold War. I'd have to go back and kind of rack my brain to remember, but you know, uh, I think we were responsible for about 50% of world GNP at the end of the war. That's pretty amazing. And yet the impact or the share of the world's impact on our GNP was relatively small. In other words, whatever we did had an enormous impact on everybody else. And what others did had a less impact on us than we had on them. That's not a sustainable economic model. And of course, we don't have it today. And in fact, where we could dictate what happened abroad in another time, we can't today. There are too many other powers that are strong and have national interests that are not always aligned with us, and we have to find ways to work with them as constructively as possible. I think Americans need to understand why we need to do this, and part of that is to understand that it's not possible to go it alone in this world. We have to work for collective solutions. And so call that a story. I would call it a series of stories. I would call it a mindset. You know, journalists do a very good job these days thinking of news as packages, foreign reporting. It used to be foreign correspondents would go abroad and they had a relatively high level of autonomy. Some of the stories are even hilarious when, for example, and this happened with more than one newspaper, but the one I've always liked best is 3 of Baltimore Sun reporters all assigned themselves to go cover a UN conference in Geneva, and they all showed up and saw each other there. That's very inefficient, and is not going to happen today because foreign desks do a much better job of controlling and marshaling their forces overseas so that they can have them do stories that are packages where somebody specializes, covers one aspect of a story in Italy and somebody else covers it in France and somebody else covers terrorism in Germany, and they put it together into a story that is more coherent and makes more sense. And that's a big plus. But I think there's something else here that we have to keep in mind. And I think, by the way, that technique can be used to cover stories to show how various sets of issues have an impact on the United States. I would offer, however, another way to think about this, which is the fact that journalists can be so easily managed from the foreign desk in newspapers also has, I believe, limited their ability to go out and find stories on their own that aren't ordered up by Washington or New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. And I think there's a lot to be said for journalists who are given enough freedom to go and actually nose around and find out stories that people don't know are important yet. Now, it's kind of hard to say what that story would be because by definition, it's stories we don't know. But that's sort of the flip side of the packages, and I wanted to throw that in as an example. And then I'm gonna raise a final point that's complicated, but I think it's one that illustrates a problem that foreign reporters have. So, and that's the Ukraine. Now, because I'm going to tell the story in a way that sounds like I might not be supportive of helping Ukraine, which I definitely am, I'm going to start out by saying that when the war in Ukraine started, I actually volunteered to go over and participate with the government, with the Ukrainian government and their military. Now, I mean, obviously, I'm too old to be a Marine combat officer anymore, but I do know how to live in combat, and that's number one. And number two, I know how the world works, how war works. And number three, I do have some skills that could be useful for the Ukrainians to help tell their story. Okay, so much for that. But having said that, I think we need to understand a difficult problem that this war presents for us. On the one hand, as I see it, we need to make sure we cover it, and we need to make sure people understand what Ukraine is enduring and what the consequences could be for Ukraine to lose. On the other hand, I think we need to also recognize that how do I put this? That there's a penchant for Americans and American journalists to impose ideas about other countries as if they are going to be like us. This happened in China during the 1930s and 40s when everybody said, oh, the Chinese communists really aren't communists. They're just agrarian reformers. And of course, they weren't agrarian reformers at all. They were Marxists who had a Marxist agenda. Well, I I think we need to recognize that we don't have any guarantee what a Ukraine that prevailed in the war would actually look like. You know, it has a long history of corruption. One of the reasons that Zelensky has been so successful at marshaling international support is because he's such a great communicator. And honestly, I think the way to talk about it is propagandist. There's martial law is imposed. There isn't anything like free media in Ukraine, and so I think we need to recognize that. You know, when the war first started, I was talking to a journalist actually at a wedding, who was a friend of my son's, who was covering Ukraine, and I said, you know, we ought to be careful about propaganda. And he immediately went back and told my son, your father's really, you know, against Ukraine. Well, you know, I don't think that's true. But I think it is true that we have to ask, what happens after this is all over? And that's a difficult balancing act. Is it really true that journalists should only cover one side of the story, which is the side we want to win? Or do we need to get people to think about what needs to be done to make sure that when we invest all of this effort in Ukraine, we get an outcome that we can be proud of? And we can't, of course, impose our system on another country, but we have to be asking ourselves, to what extent are we enabling or are we contributing to a situation where it may not be an outcome that we like? That's a complicated thing to do in foreign policy and in foreign reporting, but I think it ranks with fairly high in terms of importance.
Who was it who said that the first casualty of war is the truth?
Yes. Well, that's true. And as you know, I wrote a book on government propaganda, so I have a special interest in it.
Yeah, if you look back at U.S. history, we don't always have a very good track record of picking our friends. Afghanistan in the 1980s is a great example. For those in the audience who may be interested, and folks, please put something in the Q&A. We don't have any questions yet, and we want you to be part of this conversation and ask what you will. Meaning of life, we'll do in another session, but things related to John's career and foreign correspondence, please. We know you have them. Please put them in the Q&A. For those in the audience who may be interested in becoming a foreign correspondent, what's your advice to them? I'm especially thinking of my students, and I encourage them especially to put something in the Q&A so I know they're paying attention. Well,
I've always felt that one of the best ways to be a foreign correspondent, one viable way of being a foreign correspondent is to freelance. And a lot of great journalists began as freelancers overseas. But I'd add two caveats to that. The first is you shouldn't be going overseas until you've been trained to be a journalist. That means you need to work at a newspaper. I went overseas as a freelancer, but I worked at the Milwaukee Journal before I went abroad. And I learned a lot about how to be a journalist. And the second thing that we now have to recognize is that journalism is, as we've already discussed, perilous. And so the idea of just going over as a freelancer is not always a good idea and really has to be thought about, especially in countries where the danger levels are fairly high. So the first thing I'd say is at least get some training, some real serious training. And then the second thing is to think carefully about whether it wouldn't be better to work your way up through the AP or find a home at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Bloomberg, and so forth. There are places to get training, special training. The Pulitzer Center, which does a good job of covering foreign news and getting stories out and distributing them, is a place where young journalists can get a chance to get some experience overseas in a setting where they actually have people who are monitoring what they do and can help them grow in the job. There's also a very good scholarship program from the Overseas Press Foundation, which is, I think, right now seeking applications or will be soon. That's a place to go. And then, of course, another thing to do in college is to have study abroad programs, take study abroad programs, like the one that you did, Nerissa, getting students overseas and getting them comfortable with living abroad. But I guess that's my advice for what it's worth.
All right, thank you so much. We do have a question from one of our audience members. What are your thoughts on how foreign correspondents have handled reporting in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, the other war that's going on?
It's hard to find a country that's more difficult to provide coverage that is not going to be heavily criticized by one side or the other than is the case in Israel. It's just very, very difficult. And because the emotion levels are so high. I can't say that I made an exhaustive study of coverage, but I can say that I felt there has been coverage that looked to me as if it were balanced and tried to give a picture of both sides and their grievances. Do I think it's perfect? No, of course, no coverage is ever perfect. And again, what I read is in a few places. I don't read what every American's reading. And so I don't know that I can speak to whether the average American is getting a good, clear picture of what's going on. So I guess that's the best I can answer that question.
Thank you, Jack. Oyiza Adaba has a question here. Do you have any experience with news gathering in or about Africa?
I only did one story in Africa. I went to do a story. I spent a month in Tanzania, which was quite interesting. And I spent a lot of it writing about development. This was many years ago. It was in the 1970s. Writing about development. And also, I spent a whole day with Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of the country. And of course, was there George Washington. And I went up to his house by Lake Victoria's family house and spent a whole day with him. One of the best interviews I ever had, actually. He was very engaging. He had been he was an intellectual president, and he was very witty, and he handled the interview very well. In fact, one of the things I asked was I kept asking about political prisoners, of which he had some, and finally, and I give names, like, what about this person? What about that person? And finally became impatient, but also just said, Jack, everything we do with political prisoners, we learned from the British. I always thought that was very amusing. And the second thing is I pressed him on the fact that he had this idea of Ujamaa socialism, where he wanted to create a socialist country. But some of these things weren't working. And so he started creating quasi-private organizations, Aristotles, I guess you could call them. And one of them was a soap company. And so I was digging in on the soap company question. And he said, he said with a kind of a grin on his face, you can't have socialism without soap. His point being that, I have to do what works. We have to get soap to people. So he was a very interesting character. And I learned a lot. But that's my only experience in Africa, just one.
Okay, just to follow up, Oyiza has a website that covers news about Africa to help fill in some of those coverage gaps. And she is an SPJ International Community member based in New York City. So for those who may want to take advantage of her expertise, we wanted to share that with you. We have a question.
I'm doing that. That's good. That's very good. I'll look at it.
We have a question from Olivia Gilliand. The stereotype that Americans are uneducated, loud, disrespectful, and etc. What advice do you have for establishing credibility abroad and building relationships with communities who may be hesitant? And we've talked about how America is no longer necessarily the good guy on the world stage. And as a follow-up, what can we as journalists do to immerse ourselves in their culture and history while staying objective?
Yeah, those are good questions. So let's see. First of all, there is tension between being expert and being able to translate what you see into stories that make sense for or resonate with the average American. The Chicago Daily News, I'm going to go back to that, and I'm going to go back to Paul Scott Maurer. The Daily News, I would argue, is the most important, is the first modern American newspaper, and with high ethical standards and high ambitions. They had the first corps of foreign correspondents, but the list of things they did goes on and on. It was a great newspaper in its day. There were various reasons it didn't survive. One was it was an afternoon paper, and there are others. It won prizes all the time. And the owner, it was a penny paper, by the way, and the owner, a very interesting character named Victor Lawson, wasn't unhappy to run the lead story on the front page being the Chicago Cubs baseball score. But he had some of the best writers in the country, and reporters like Paul Scott Maurer would get inside stories on the second page or third, I can't remember which it was, where they would basically, as Maurer said, I would write as if I was writing a story for other diplomats. I mean, pretty high level stories. And he was abroad for many, many years and was respected overseas. I'm not sure that's the best kind of reporting. And by the way, he was a very good shoe leather reporter, in addition to these longer, thoughtful pieces that he and other members of the staff wrote. But there is this tension between local or between reporting for your audience and knowing so much that you start becoming so expert, you're talking to just other experts. And one way to combat that, of course, is to have reporters abroad for a while and then bring them back home. Not have them spend their entire life overseas. The other thing that needs to be done, however, and has been done, is more investment in those reporters to make sure they speak the languages and are culturally immersed. The New York Times is not going to send a reporter, and neither are many other newspapers, to Russia if they don't speak Russian. I mean, to be stationed there permanently, they're just not going to do it. The same thing applies to China. Two languages that are not the easiest for Americans to learn. That's a long way from when Colonel McCormick once assembled all of his foreign correspondents in one room and went around the room and asked them what they spoke. And only one of them said he only spoke English. And Colonel McCormick said, "That's great. That's the kind of reporter I want. I don't want them to get too involved overseas." Well, that's obviously preposterous. You can't do a good job reporting if you don't know how to deal with other countries. But so there is this balance that we need to have. Certainly, students who want to go overseas, as I just already said, need to get experience and study foreign relations as a minor if they're a journalism student, and go abroad on study abroad programs and embrace the idea of traveling overseas. So I think I've dealt with that part of the question, but let me go on to what I think is the other question. How do you learn to deal in other countries? And I think this observation applies to all journalism, but that doesn't make it any less relevant for working overseas, where maybe it's even more important. Journalism is gotcha journalism maybe has a place, but it doesn't have a place in foreign news. In foreign news, your job is to try to understand why people are doing what they do. You may not like it. I think that even applies to terrorist organization. We have a lot to learn about why terrorists are terrorists and what kind of infrastructure is put up and what kind of interests exist to make them into terrorists. That we don't have to condone it, but we have to understand it. It's a difficult story to do for obvious reasons, access to the information being one of them. But we need to try to understand other people and their motivations when we report about them, rather than necessarily just being judgmental. That's, I think, the first thing. And that means being empathetic, means being I mean, these are very obvious things. It means being a good listener. It means spending time with people overseas, not spending time with other Americans who are just like you. Uh, there are some journalists who have acquired an incredible ability to do these things. One was Vincent Sheehan, one of the great journalists of the 20th century, who was almost, I know this will sound crazy, had psychic powers of discernment. He actually decided to go to India at one point because he believed, and I know this because I read his diary, I've written extensively about him, he believed that Gandhi would be assassinated by a Hindu, which is what happened. Now, there weren't a lot of people at the time saying, oh yeah, that was going to happen. He just had this incredible, he was incredible. And he was there, right there when Gandhi was assassinated. So you can put that down to unusual psychic powers, but in the case of people like Sheehan, he did spend a lot of time overseas, and he was able to draw a lot of good judgments. So we try to have this balance between being expert and still being in touch with people at home. And I think that's always a constant balance. And also, when you are overseas, doing the best you can to actually understand other people without just judging them.
Thank you. Let's backtrack just a moment. For those in our audience who may not know who Colonel McCormick was, will you please enlighten us?
So Colonel McCormick was part of the family, the Medill family, that owned the Chicago Daily News. The Chicago Tribune, sorry. Okay. His family owned the New York Daily News and some other papers. But he's the one that became the publisher. And he was a very quirky guy, to say the least. He did institute his own idea of how certain spellings for American words that were different, that sounded more phonic. He was a great rival. The paper was a rival of the Chicago Daily News, but a much lesser newspaper until the 1960s, 70s. Because he was so heavy-handed, and he was very right. He was very Republican, and that also bled into the newspaper. But he also had some very great foreign correspondents, William Shire and other people like that.
Thank you, Jack. We have a question from Kaylin Pickett. Other than war correspondence, what are some of the most important types of reporting that foreign correspondents cover?
So that's a great question. So obviously wars are important. One of the difficulties of being a foreign correspondent is that you really have to be able to cover almost anything. You have to cover politics. You have to cover conflict. You have to cover culture, theater, art. You have to cover the environment. You have to know a lot about a lot of things. You'd have to be able to be your own little mini newsroom, as it were. And that's one of the reasons why being a foreign correspondent has always been one of the most gloried jobs. That on the one hand, you were abroad, you weren't right next to your editors, although they may be more close today than they were in the past. They still were not in the newsroom, which did give them some autonomy. And they were paid well. They were the first to regularly get bylines. Bylines were very rare. But foreign correspondents, because of the investment you had in them, they became personalities, and so they became lionized. And the best ones were able to write lots of different kinds of stories. I think the kinds of stories we need to be looking at today that are important are ones, and this is my own predilection, I realize it. I've always been more interested in stories that explain what's happening. And try to provide context so people can understand events better. And so there are trade stories we need to think about that are important. I think clearly environmental stories are important. Migration stories and refugee stories are very important. I hadn't said this in my earlier list of stories that need to be covered, but one that really needs to be covered, and it is being covered, but we can do more and more on it, is try to understand why so many countries believe that democracy isn't necessarily a very enviable system of government. In the past, 30, 40 years ago, even countries that transgressed and were autocracies or tyrannies would say they were democratic in some way. They would try to say that what they were doing was democratic. Now many countries feel that saying you're democratic, why would we want to be democratic? Like you. Like, look what happens in your country. I mean, how democratic is it to have people invade the Capitol building or deny that elections were lost when they were? And so, but that's not the reason that's a reason for us to be criticized, but it's not the reason why countries are choosing more authoritarian governments. And I think we need to know more about that. It's not true, as many political scientists used to say, that democracies never fight with each other. I'm afraid that's an oversimplification. But it is true that the rule of law and adherence to certain kinds of norms do help us get along. And as a result of that, we need to understand what it is that's making countries decide that they don't care about these norms, or don't think that democratic government is really a viable way to operate, because it loses a common language for us in dealing with those countries. We need to know much more about that. And while we can decry what they're doing, we need to understand why it is that in so many countries that people think this is okay or are willing to accept it.
I ran across a quote that said, a country that has Democratic or Republic in its name is usually neither. We have a question from Mildred Wynn. How much should foreign correspondents involve themselves in the stories they are reporting on, such as providing help to a suffering family in a war zone? And how should objective reporting be reconciled with moral or ethical obligations?
Well, I have a friend Peter Copeland, who was a very fine foreign correspondent and Washington bureau chief. And by the way, would-be journalists should read his memoir because it's very good. It's a very good memoir. And Peter tells a story of one of his reporters when he was a bureau chief. Peter covered a lot of wars, but one of his reporters was covering the war in Iraq, and decided and he was embedded. And his view was that he would be with those reporters, but he would never carry a gun. Mm-hmm. He would never do anything to be involved in the war. And one night he was out there with a tank unit, and the tank unit said to him, "You're going to have a turn and watch, while the rest of us sleep." And he said, "No, I won't do that." Well, I think that's a bit far-fetched. I think if you're one of those guys, you better serve your term. But I don't necessarily support the idea of picking up a gun unless your life is immediately threatened. And I think that being embedded does present certain problems of being too involved with the war, although a ground level view of what goes on is also important. That's sort of one way to look at this. Another way is there are certain moments when people are in distress, and as a human being, you have to help them. That doesn't mean, however, that your job is to color the news in a direction that they might favor. It's one thing to be humanitarian, but it's another thing to write stories that are propaganda. That are purposely propagandistic. And so I think, I think you have to decide while you're on the ground how you try to draw that line. But I will say, having said all of that, I will say something else that I think adds complexity to this. I think there is a lot to be said for journalists, and particularly foreign correspondents, to sometimes write in the first person. Now, the school of journalism that I grew up in, was you never talked about yourself in the story. There was a famous story once about how there was a fire in the AP, headquarters in New York. And when the AP covered the story, they never talked to any other reporters. They never quote any other reporters about what happened. They only quoted the fire department. Well, you know, but it's a good rule in many ways because it's a reminder that you're supposed to be an observer, not a participant. But it is also true that you are an observer and you are a creature of how you observe and what you see at any given time. And sometimes it's good to say, this is what I saw. This is what I saw. And this is how I saw it. The way a scientist does an experiment. You know, I did it this way. At this time, I did this. These were the ingredients I added. In other words, we evaluate the value of the experiment by trying to understand the conditions under which it was done. And because everybody exists in a certain place at a certain time under certain circumstances, all of those things can have an impact on what you see and how you report it. Not because you're biased per se, not because you have an agenda, but because that's what you see. And that allows the reader, I think, to say, okay, I understand. Jack Hamilton saw this at that point. And it makes, it adds a level of credibility, I think, to the story. Now, having said that, I think you could go even further. And I go back to Vincent Sheehan, whom I admire so much. Vincent Sheehan was a very emotional guy. He had nervous breakdowns once in a while. And he was in Austria when the Nazis took over. And it's called the Anschluss. And he was there and he covered it. And he covered it for the New York Herald Tribune. Sheehan oftentimes worked as a freelancer, but he worked for the Herald Tribune, which was a respectable, basically Republican newspaper. And this story was on the front page by a person who was a contract reporter for them, not a staff member. It was a lead story under his byline. And at the end of it, I wish I had marked it, I could read it to you. But at the end of it, he says something like this. There are a lot of people that thinks what's happening here is just kind of, a few dissidents who kind of support the Nazis. But I want to tell you that in the time I've been here the last weeks, I have observed something else. I can't give you a source for any of these things, but it's what I've seen. And it is that the Nazi National Socialism appeals to a wide range of people, disaffected youth, people out of work, even some intellectuals. And the only way this will end is in world war. Mm. That's an incredible story. That's an incredible story. He said it with great authority. He told you what he knew, what he didn't know, how he got it in a condensed sort of way. Now, I don't think I'd want every one of my reporters going out and pontificating on every story. So I understand the pitfalls of that. But you want people who have the capacity to size things up for you. And there are other ways it could have been done, perhaps more in accordance with with our standards of how we source and how we frame stories. But there's a lot to be said for somebody saying, here's what I found out. Here's what it looks like to me.
Thank you so much. We have a traditional last question that we want to ask, but Dan has put in the chat a link. We promised you a recipe for French 75 and how you can get that from John's book. And there are some variations on that. So we want to keep our promise on that front. The traditional last question for these talks is this. What does press freedom mean to you? Jack, if you'll close us out with that, please.
Right. So I know that when you ask this question, you generally expect and get pithy comments designed to be quotable about the joys of working in a country that allows free speech. And I will not deny that I relish the opportunity, even in my 70s now, to continue writing and reporting and thinking about what's going on and be able to express myself on it. But I also think, to be honest, that I think we have to be careful about platitudes right now. Large numbers numbers of the public have their doubts about journalists and how well they use their rights to cover the news. Of course, they confuse sometimes journalists with people who have a specific agenda. They're not journalists at all. They just present themselves as journalists. But nevertheless, they have concerns. There are members of the Supreme Court that are making noises that they think we should reconsider the First Amendment. And there are liberals like Tim Wu, the Columbia University law professor, and also somebody who's been in both the Obama and Biden administrations working on social media issues, who has raised the question of whether the First Amendment really fits conditions as they exist today. He argues that technology has made information very plentiful, so it's not scarce anymore, and that the First Amendment was created to deal with scarce information and make sure that that information could get out. Now he says the scarcity is enough listeners who can hear the news because they're always being interdicted by false news. And it's an interesting concept. I'm not saying I buy it completely, but he does call for enforcement mechanisms, and it may call for some rules and regulations about how we manage speech. I'm not saying I buy these, but I don't see how we can ignore that we'd face a world in which these become very important questions. There are people on the Supreme Court whose idea of what the First Amendment should be, I'm almost certain, are at odds with mine. But I can imagine that we need to find mechanisms to deal with transgressions of foreign speech. I had a Chinese professor who always used to say, freedom, freedom. That's great, but freedom to do what? And I think we have to ask ourselves, what freedom, how are we using that freedom?
All right. I want to thank those of you who submitted questions and made our conversation possible and more interesting. Please join me in thanking Jack, Maxwell Hamilton for an interesting and fascinating conversation. If you want to be informed of future IC Talks, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. Dan has posted the link in the chat box. You can also drop us a line at the email address Dan has put in the chat box. Again, many thanks to Jack and to each of you for joining us this evening. Be careful, stay well, and may the journalism be with you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.